welcome to From No to Nothing Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Kent Wesihaus, an author, professor, and licensed clinical social worker who worked for 25 years in television production. Today, I'll interview Kent about his background, his new book, Stop Breaking Down, The Secret to Avoiding Overwhelming Crackup, his systems-based psychological theory, and hopefully we'll have time for a discussion on how these topics holistically integrate philosophically. All right, Kent, welcome to the show. Thanks for being on. What would you like to tell the listeners about yourself?
Wow. Well, Joel, thank you for having me on. I have had a varied career. For the last 15 or so years, I've been a licensed clinical social worker largely in private practice more recently, and before that, working in psychiatric hospitals and community clinics. And before that, I had a 25-year career in television production. And I sort of came to my senses in the early 2000s and switched to a helping profession. Currently, I have a book out, as you said, Stop Breaking Down, The Secret to Avoiding Overwhelming Crackup, which can be found through my website, kentw.net. And that's kind of a broad stroke leads to answer your question.
All right. Okay. It's a good place to start. So, I think that a lot of people right off the bat, they hear, we have a lot of people on who have worked in psychology or have done social work, who have been authors. But I think you might be the first one on who's worked in television. And I think a lot of people get real starry-eyed about that. So I'd just like to start out by asking, what did you learn in your time in television and why did you decide to leave it?
Well, you used the term starry-eyed. That's really good because that's how it was for me when I first got in to the business, which was in the late 70s. Not to give away my age, but and it was starry-eyed. I'd walk onto a sound stage and go, oh man, I've arrived. I am now working in this business. And it's hard to describe this feeling of everything is a set and it's overly air conditioned and it's hushed unless, something's happening. So over time, starry-eyed, I was working and I did a lot of different things. I was an associate producer, a line producer, director, associate director, stage manager, promo producer, writer. I did a lot of things across the 25 years. And so as I worked on various shows into the 1990s, it became increasingly apparent to me that the kinds of shows I had chosen to work on were causing more harm than good. And I had to get out and start doing something which I considered pro-social, as opposed to some degree antisocial, which is what I think some of the tabloid shows I was working on amounted to. So there you go.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing that you say there. And I think that a lot of people sort of have that intuitive sense, of some television and some social media and that sort of stuff that maybe it's doing a little bit more harm than good. And, I know that it's all technology is a tool, right? And tools can be used for good and for bad. What about the television industry from what you saw was having a negative effect on either you or society as a whole?
Well, part of it was my own choices. I look back and, as Erik Erikson might say, I'm doing a little bit of a life review. There were some key points of choices that I made that I now regret, but at the same time, had I not made them, I wouldn't have gone into a much more satisfying industry. So, or business. I worked on shows which were benign and entertaining initially. I don't think they were creating too much false or distorted imagery, maybe some. But then the low-hanging fruit to me became, as I said, tabloid television, which, in the late 1990s was just sort of coming into its own. Now that model has been adopted by news outlets everywhere. And so the kind of sensationalist stuff I was working on then seems to be the norm now. And it's like, oh man. So I regret being part of that. I regret not making other choices and aiming higher. Some of the shows that I did, I think were actually, did more good than harm. I worked on the Arsenio Hall show for 6 years. And that show, by and large, the first African-American man to have a late night talk show, was quite celebrated at the time. And I was happy to have worked on that. There were a few things that happened on that show on the air that people took issue with, but regardless, I think it was a big step forward. And unfortunately, now many people don't even remember Arsenio that much, but he was quite good in his own day.
All right. Yeah. So, and this is all stuff that is going to play into the conversation as we go along. So, how did you start developing your theory of system-based psychology?
Well, systems thinking, systems work is, as you know, I'm sure, part of the education that you get as either a psychologist, a social worker, a marriage and family therapist, or a counselor, that systems are to be considered all around us as well as within us. And this stimulated me quite a bit when I first started grad school. I thought, oh, this is a different way of seeing the world, a much more valuable way. And at the same time, I came to see in the last few years that it almost doesn't go far enough, because we're embedded in the systems. We are embedded in them, and they influence our thinking all the time. It's like an umbrella that's just, this is a poor metaphor, but an umbrella that's raining stuff down on us all the time and always influencing our thinking. And to work to step away from those systems, to step back from them, even though you're embedded in them, is hard to do. It takes a lot of cognitive energy. And that's part of what I'm trying to get people to do with my book. One of the main things that hit me in my research, I started reading stuff by a guy named Endel Tulving, a Canadian professor who talked about what he defines as autonoetic consciousness. And noetic consciousness being theorized, being the consciousness in mammals and birds, and autonoetic consciousness, self-aware, abstract thinking, being able to think about the future, predicting the future, worrying about the future, or ruminating about the past. That seems to be more peculiar to humans. Now, it may be on a continuum. You may say, oh, no, my dog or cat, has self-awareness. I would question that to a large degree, but I don't know. I can't get inside their skin to say for sure one way or another. But it seems from their behaviors and from our behaviors that we're far more concerned with our self-awareness. What I call in my book, I, me, mine consciousness, is both a blessing and a curse, because we're able to, from a survival standpoint, it's been something that we are able to plan for the future. We are able to collaborate among ourselves and create great inventions and, for better or worse, take over the world. From the curse part of it, we are also stuck with ruminating about things and telling ourselves stories over and over and over. And as we tell these stories, repeatedly, they increasingly feel like they're granite hard truths, when in fact they're just stories we're telling ourselves. And so this is part of the systems based situation I was talking about. The systems within us, our cognitive systems, result in our consciousness. What Daniel Siegel would say is an integration of the systems within us result in our self-aware consciousness. And there's a big flap and uproar about mental health crises in America and the world currently. And it seems to me at the core of it is our peculiar I, me, mine consciousness. If you have looked at the works of Peter Levine et al., or maybe Bessel van der Kolk, or even Dan Siegel, others like them, you know that they observe mammals as being able to shake off stresses, traumas, life-threatening events, shake them off and just go on to the next moment in their life, perhaps with a schema stamped on their brain of, avoid that watering hole, danger there. But it's not a rumination of, I was almost killed. I need to think about how I was almost killed over and over and over. It's a stamp of danger there. Nurturance is someplace else. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So you said a lot there, and a lot of it will really resonate with a lot of our listeners. Because, as a philosophy show, we're always thinking about, like you said, the embeddedness of our subjective viewpoint within reality. And how do we determine what reality is when we can only see it from our viewpoint? And, with systems, looking at systems and we need systems in order to describe reality. But systems also have an inherent limitation in how we choose to describe things. And one of my favorite examples to use on the show is animal models, right? Because in some ways, by looking at animals, it helps us to understand the limitations of our own views in some way. And I think what you were just saying, I had an encounter like this at work yesterday. I was looking out the window, and I'm in Western New York, so we're near Buffalo, where you get 6 feet of snow in a day. So this time of year, it's already pretty cold. You're looking at the mid 40s, and I look outside, and there's these little songbirds taking a bath in a puddle. Just throwing the water all over themselves and stuff. And you think even outside of danger, life and death, food and mating, and those really big important highlights. Right down to discomfort, humans have these things, right? Because as a human, you go, man, I would not get into the water just because it would be cold, right? It would bother me. And I was talking to another guy the other day who was reflecting on how, COVID was so terrible because we had to wear masks and it was irritating, right? And I go, well, the easiest way to get over those things is trying to give them some perspective, right? You go, well, is a mask irritating? Yes. But when I compare it to other points in my life where I've endured great pain or misery or danger, these sorts of things, all of a sudden it doesn't seem so bad. Same thing with the cold, right? I'm looking outside at the birds going, oh man, that looks really cold. But when I was in the Army, there was one time when I was in Wisconsin in February, and it was negative 20, and I was riding in the back of an open truck at 40 miles an hour. And, my hands froze all the way up to my elbow. I couldn't move my fingers or anything. And you go, well, I've dealt with greater cold than this, right? And I think that's something that we miss in modernity is I think when we separate ourselves from our sensations and the fact that we are animals, right? And some of those discomforts, and we go, oh, well, any little thing throws us out of equilibrium. But if you have some experiences to reflect on where you go, oh, well, this was actually much harder, or there's other people in the world who are going through much greater things. Sometimes just that perspective is enough to ease some of the psychological problems that we we make up for ourselves in some ways.
Right. Well, that you made several good points there. The water is cold. I would never get into that. That's a story you're telling yourself. Okay. And the more it bounces around your head, the truer it's going to feel. It's too cold. I'd never get in there. It's too cold. I'd never get in there. And then, in fact, I don't know if you said you froze your arms up to your elbows. I mean, you jump into a High Sierras lake in the springtime. It'll be bracing, but you're going to survive. You're going to get out of it, and you'll surround yourself with a whole new system, and that will give you a different perspective. And so yeah, and then there is sort of degrees of things. Like you said, yeah, wearing a mask is irritating. Is it as irritating as having your hands frozen for several hours up to your elbows? I don't think so. It's so funny. I'm now remembering a quote. This is a little bit off base, but on the old Arsenio show, Alan Rickman, the actor Alan Rickman, had come on to promote something, and Arsenio said to him very seriously, was it hard doing this role in this film for you? And he said, was it hard? Well, compared to what? Compared to coal mining? No, I shouldn't think so.
And that's exactly,
right.
That's exactly it, right? It's just lots of times all it takes to pull yourself out of some psychological problems is a shift in perspective. But so
deliberately trying to tell yourself a different story. And this can come down to everyday moments. If I have a challenging client awaiting me and I'm driving to the office when I used to have an office, and I'm feeling fear or dread about this client, if I tell myself, you're going to be fine, you know what you're doing, you're going to be fine, you're going to make your way through this, and it's all going to come out fine, as opposed to, oh, this is terrible, what do I have to do? Deliberately change the story you're telling yourself, even if you don't believe it. Change it.
Yeah. It's funny because I was just mentioning, I think it was the podcast last week, I was mentioning I'll do that same thing at work. If I'm driving into work and I'm thinking about all the terrible things that are going to happen, I have a bad day. But if I think of all the terrible things as just, fun challenges that I'm going to use problem solving to overcome, right? Because you want to know what? Every day I've gone to work, I've come back. I've been alive. I've continued to have a job. So it's all turned out fine to this point. So there's no reason to think that something catastrophically different would happen. I've been doing it for several years. I've got the lay of the land on what to do. So yeah, sometimes those sort of negative thoughts will get in our head and sort of get us into a bad spot. So why don't you give us an overview of your theory? Like you said, there's a lot of systems-based thinking in psychology already. What separates your theory or adds to the existing body of work?
I was trying to figure out what, the old 1950s, 60s terms. What is the cause of our neurosis? Why are increasing numbers of us having what we call mental health problems, depression, anxiety, psychosis, obsessive compulsive, these things, ADHD, we see these things running rampant and increasing. What is that about? I asked myself. I know how to work with it. I know the treatments. I've been trained to intervene, and a lot of them are effective. With most people, I'm happy to keep participating in them and doing them. But why is this happening? And again, it is because of self-aware, abstract thinking consciousness. That's, to me, it seems like that's, I guess, maybe it's just a lead pipe cinch. Maybe it's a redundant thing to say, but I don't think we think about that in our trainings. When we go to grad school and get trained as therapists or interventionists of some sort, we're not trained about what's behind all this. We can talk about traumas and how they affect people. The original PTSD diagnosis coming from, shell shock and what did they call it? A war neurosis, I think, originally. And this developed into the whole field of trauma studies. Why is it that we are so much more affected by this stuff than the animals around? Animals get into awful, horrible fights with each other, right? And if they survive, they don't hold on to it nearly as much as we do. And I'm not saying we should stop holding on to it. I'm just trying to understand why, and so that is largely what I was aiming for. And this was at the beginning of the pandemic. I was trying to make some sense out of things as we became more and more polarized, and I was hearing more and more things that, to me, just I couldn't understand how people were embracing certain points of view, and I was trying to understand why they were. So, one thing that you mentioned before that I just want to go back on and touch on, you were saying that animals experience things like the birds in the cold pond and so on. One of the things, the big movement towards meditation and sitting with your own thoughts or sitting with your own sensations, I began to realize that this is a way that maybe mammals below us in the evolutionary chain have quite a bit to teach us. This is a way of becoming, of shedding some autonoetic properties, just for moments. In other words, the idea of a meditation that is specifically focused on the senses, and you put cognitive energy into that. Thoughts try and intrude. That's their job. I have this technique where I'll try and visualize the thought as like a tube coming out of my head. Oh, there's that thought. Automatically gives me distance from it. Okay. And so, different techniques I've used with different clients, like some people like to use a bubble, that they'll see the thoughts floating around in. But the idea of getting distance from your thoughts on the one hand, on the other, being with just in the moment. What's the tactile sensation you feel right now? What are you hearing right now? What are you smelling right now? It's difficult to stay with these for more than an instant, but it's a practice that if you can, even just for a few instances, stay with these things, I theorize this is what a mammal's life, is like. That I smell, I hear, I see, and then perhaps the most important thoughts are opportunity here, danger here, and it's not so much a rumination; it's just a being with, right? Being with right now, and so the practice of that, I think, can help us maybe gain some of the leg up that mammals have on us, and just in terms of quote unquote neuroses.
Yeah. Again, you said a lot of interesting things there, and a lot of things that we're talking about in the course of the regular podcast. So this will be kind of like a fun sort of teaser for the listeners, because we're looking at the French Renaissance philosophers Montaigne and Pascal, and how Montaigne, really said you need to live in the moment and sort of, look at momentary pleasures. And Pascal was more about thinking about the hard questions and the deep questions in life is what makes us human. And then on top of that, my own personal life, I've been reading through the Tao Te Ching, as well as some Buddhist Zen philosophies and things. And it's very similar. It's much like you were saying, where a lot of those philosophies are focused around this idea of living in this moment, and sort of emptying your mind. And it's not that intellectualism is necessarily wrong or evil or anything like that, but it's just the fact that in many cases, if you're not doing advanced planning, right? If you're looking at strategic issues, then intellectualism is good. But if you're looking at tactical issues, what you're doing in the moment, lots of times it's better to trust the physical and mental faculties that you have, right? Like an athlete, they talk about the more an athlete thinks about, hitting a baseball or throwing a football, the worse they're going to do, right?
Yes.
The practice, the repetition builds it into the mind muscle connection.
Muscle memory, right.
Right. And so, yeah, there's a lot of interesting aspects to what you're saying that we've sort of been looking at and that are echoed in definitely some Eastern philosophies and religions throughout time,
right.
Less so, on the Western side, but so,
right. But, so and they're both valuable. I mean, these are two broad systems that make us up as humans. Number one, we have evolved from mammals. So we do have a capability of experiencing, mammalian sensations in the moment. But our thoughts hijack us. Our thoughts say, oh, think about what you're going to have for dinner. Do you have enough gas in the car? What happens if so-and-so comes to visit? And so the thoughts are valuable. They're doing their job. But sometimes the practice of just being here and now with reducing the thoughts can help us restore a certain balance that may be lost with a ruminating stance, which many of us have, or probably all of us have from time to time, at least.
Yeah, and I think that sort of the two things we've been talking about so far might lead to something that you just mentioned. You're talking about how some of the impetus for what you've been thinking about came from during the pandemic and the increasing polarization that's happening. And, I think that from what I've sort of seen, it has to do with a couple of those things we just mentioned. One is the perspective, right? Trying to view things from others' points of view seems to be lacking. And the other one, I think, is that rumination factor where people get their thoughts, they tell themselves their stories, and then they continue to let those thoughts and stories sort of develop uninterrupted by outside perspectives. Do you think that that's kind of an accurate characterization of it, or?
Well, my book talks a bit about this, that in the first decades of the 21st century, we are embedded in systems that includes kind of an onslaught of social media, regular media, TV, and audio, as well as, perhaps not quite as important, but they still have an effect on us, just modern urban stimulation, whether it's cars zooming by us all the time, airplanes, sirens. But more importantly, the media and social media repeating, we have instant access to stories that people have created worldwide. And because more eyeballs go to ones where there's danger, threat, possibly blood, the people who own the media they're going to put those things up there more often because they want to sell more of their sponsors' stuff, or else collect more of your data. So, consequently, we have repeated images of beatings, car crashes, plane crashes, wars. Now, these things are real. I'm not saying they don't happen, but they're not happening every minute. Okay. And if you're familiar with Daniel Kahneman, the availability heuristic. If this stuff is available, it's going to feel like it's always, this is it. This is my world. This is always happening. And these are the systems that surround us in the 21st century, where we need to have a constant cognitive energy reminding us that, sure, there's bad stuff around, but it's not happening every second, and it's not happening in my front yard necessarily, right? And that the world is a dangerous place, but it's not immediately dangerous to me right now, the way media will have us feel that it is. And again, this comes from my work on tabloid shows. This is where they sell more sponsors' products, accidents, star sensationalist stories, who's sleeping with who, all the stuff which gets overblown with incredible importance. And you lose perspective as to, okay, something is kind of important because it's happening in my town, but something is not really a threat to me because it's across the world. And I'm not saying to ignore things that are global, but to put them in perspective, to look at the systems that are selling them to us, that are showing them to us. And so then, as you said, we start to ruminate on them. We see a story is repeated to us about something that perhaps our beliefs are sympathetic to. And as it's repeated and as we say it to ourselves, it becomes granite hard truth. And in fact, no, it's just a story. It's a story based on maybe some real events, but the real events have been overblown. They've been shown 10,000 more times than they're actually occurring in front of you. So yeah. Does that address what you're talking about?
No, yeah, I think it does. And it really does highlight again the importance of philosophy, because, you have to be able to think for yourself to know where to draw the line, right? Okay. Like you said, you don't want to just live with your head in the sand and not admit that anything's going on or that anything bad's happening. But also you have to be able to look at the things that are happening and realize what's within your locus of control and what's not, what is directly harmful to you and what's not. And then on top of that, and I think what society and the world as a whole is struggling with is where to accept authoritative information from, and I think that that's where a real struggle is happening. And it's like you said, the human brain, we like to think that we're so advanced, but really we do get fooled by the simplest things. And there's a lot of emotional content that changes our stories, right? I heard somebody say the other day, there's nothing less real than a Real Housewives of Wherever episode, right? Right. Reality TV, right? There's nothing farther from reality than reality TV.
That's right.
But we watch it, and then you get your brain tricked into thinking that this is how the Kardashians live, or this is how whoever does what, and it's just not the case. But yeah, the stories that we tell ourselves, and even in smaller ways. I was a guest on somebody else's podcast a while back, and they were asking me about the process I use to write albums for music, right? And it's like you were saying, with modern technology, we're inundated with music, right? I hear music all day, every day. So what I was telling the host was, when I go to write an album, the first thing I do is, for about 2 weeks beforehand, I stop listening to any music, right? Because you already have all of that in your head. You already have all of that information, all of those stories that other people have told, all the practice that you've done, all of that's already there. You need some time with your thoughts in order to let things start connecting in ways that they can't if there's this constant background noise that's always stopping you from having these deeper connecting thoughts.
Right. That sounds, it's actually similar to sort of a meditation. The idea of separating from the onslaught of thoughts, in your case, the onslaught of music, because there's plenty of it around, to just being with what is within you and what percolates up, right? Not it's an imperfect metaphor, but it's a practice. And it sounds like as you prepared to write music, it's a practice that's valuable to you, as we prepare to walk out into the world. It's important to pay attention to our own viscera to know how the systems around us are affecting us, because your viscera will tell you if it feels dangerous, and your viscera will tell you if it feels dangerous, even if it isn't, as you watch some video on TikTok over and over and over. So yeah, it's a good practice. It takes a certain amount of cognitive energy. This is perhaps part of the blessing of self-aware consciousness, that we can channel cognitive energy to step back from the systems, and to be able to think about your thinking. I'm not just saying paying it lip service, but to even just imagine, here are all my thoughts and I'm going to step back from them. Some metaphoric image that works for you. You know, I mentioned earlier, here are the thoughts going on in my head. They're coming out of my head like tubes. That's a metaphor. How can you step back from your thoughts? How can you step back from the systems that are affecting your thoughts? We have the blessing of being able to focus our awareness on stuff like this. Now, our thoughts may intrude from time to time, but we can still bring that focus back. And so, thinking about systems that are affecting you, paying attention to your senses, your viscera, how systems are affecting you, I think in most cases will help people bring more balance to their lives.
Yeah, it's interesting how thoughts themselves can breed a lot of anxiety and a lot of almost paralysis. But thinking about the thoughts, right? Being able to give them some perspective, being able to sort of, you can never occupy an objective stance, but just being able to provide some perspective to where you are, and understand that, well, maybe the way I was seeing things isn't the way that it actually is, right? Maybe it's not as dangerous, or it's not as real, or it's not, maybe there's just something. And that little bit of leeway is enough that can allow you to interact with other people, right? Well, maybe what they're saying or what they're believing isn't all wrong, what I found is when I'm interacting with people who have beliefs that are wildly different from me, if you just ask, why do you think that, genuinely, right? Not as an accusation, but just genuine. Okay, so why do you think that? And let them talk about why they think it, and then ask questions that are interesting about it, and let them go on. Then lots of times, after 2 or 3 times of asking an interesting question, you can then point out a flaw in the thinking, and they're very accepting of changing their opinion at that point, because you've demonstrated that the position that they held has some validity, and that you are interested in having a serious dialogue, right? But you have to at least give you have to give it a chance initially, right? You have to say, maybe I don't know everything. Maybe somebody else knows something and they can share it with me, right? But it's hard to start from that point if you never step back from your own thoughts.
Right. And, a lot of what you just said is discussed by John Gottman, the noted marriage interventionist, him and his wife. Gottman talks about how when couples disagree, or not, and it's not just even only couples, it can be friends, it can be family members, it can be business partners. When people disagree, but you can see it's most crucial with couples, because couples are very vulnerable with each other. So when couples disagree, how can one person say to the other one, look, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I'm really curious to know why you see it that way, right? Is a much more validating thing to say than you're full of it. You're full of it. I just dismiss what you have to say. That's a surefire way to become emotionally unsafe to your partner, right?
Mm.
And as you're talking about, if you're talking to somebody with divergent beliefs from yours, to validate them, to say, I don't see it that way, but I'm really curious to know why you do. If you can, and then that might open the door with, okay, so this point that you made, I don't agree with it, but tell me why you think it works, and you can eventually build a dialogue. That being said, I can pretend that with politically divergent beliefs, that works for me, but I'd be lying.
Yeah.
So, it's much easier to do it on a personal level with friends, business partners, my wife, to try and take a validating stance. It's harder for me to do personally, with people with wildly divergent beliefs that I just can't wrap myself around. And again, I don't go out of my way to invalidate. I don't go out of my way to say to dismiss and say, not true, walking away. But I know my own limitations also.
Yeah, so I'll postulate something here and I'll see if you agree with it or not. I think when it comes to politics, there's a couple of things that play into why that might be the case. And I think one is that politics tends to address, almost every main issue that we face in life, right? There's your freedoms and your health and your access to resources. All of these things are governed by politics. So I think that's one level that causes people to be very defensive of their political beliefs. I think another level of it is the environment that we're in right now. I think that, if thinking back to, the 90s or, even earlier than that, you might have had some discussion. But I think the more polarized things get, the more, it's almost as if the more polarized things get, the more you can add on to a position that people might not necessarily believe, right? So let's say I'm a hard right Republican, right? Let's say that I have a few issues that are sort of my core issues. And so I stick with the Republicans. But now as things get more polarized, so the Democrats go farther this way, and they're trying to take this one thing that I have a lot that I really want. Now the Republicans recognize that and they say, okay, well, now we're going to add on these things and these things and these things as our stance. And you might not really care about those things, but you really care about losing the few things that the other side has. And this goes vice versa too, either direction. So that the more polarized you get, you might not necessarily care about all the issues, or you might not necessarily care about them to the extent that the party line does. But you look at it and you say, well, when I look at the other side, what they're trying to do now is so far outside of what I want that I can't engage with it. Do you think that is sort of an accurate representation of it, or?
Yeah, well, I think for me personally, that is, that's so far out of, away from what I believe that I can't engage with it. And it's interesting. I kind of grew up with in this starry-eyed. I caught the end of the hippie movement, and I had this really inaccurate belief that things were just going to keep getting more progressively better. And I mean progressively, as in progressively better. And so to see the great steps backwards, I would interpret it anyway, that have sort of crashed over us, has really has really kind of knocked me way afield. Like, it's like, I can't sign on to these beliefs, and but at the same time, I have enough training to know I'm not going to go attacking people for them. This kind of leads us back into the cognitive distortions thing, which I think is at the root of how a lot of our beliefs come about. We see someone in the media, or we are talking to someone, and we do an overgeneralization. I know what he's thinking. We say to ourselves, I know what he's thinking. No, in fact, you don't know what he's thinking. You see his behavior, yes. You see what he's saying, but you don't know what's inside his head. No one can get into anybody else's head. So we can make judgments on behavior. Similarly, I know what's going to happen in the future if this keeps going this way. I'm certain I know what's going to happen in the future. Again, I would say no one knows what's going to happen in the future. Things are prone to change all the time. And so these kind of stories we tell ourselves, I know what he's thinking. I know what's going to happen. It's important to step back from it and just in the moment say, no, I don't. I see how he's behaving and I don't like it, but I don't know what he's thinking. I see how things have happened in the past. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to go this way this time, right? To get distance from the stories that we tell ourselves, and that work us up into a lather, right? There's people out there. I don't want to mention parties one way or another. There's people out there that really, upset me. And I see other people upset with them. And I see these other people saying, I know what he's thinking. No, you don't. You just see how he's behaving, So anyway.
Yeah, and there's a lot of psychological studies that demonstrate we're very bad predictors of the future.
Right. Right.
And there's also a lot of psychological research that shows, using a lot of absolutist language, I know, or, always, never, these sorts of things,
yep,
are generally, have bad outcomes.
Right. And I think that's partly what led us to the conundrum we're in. So we have the onslaught of social media, which provides the echo chambers, along with our own proclivity for absolutist, all or nothing, you're with me or against me type thinking.
So, do you think that the challenges our developmental systems face today are largely positive growth pains or negative maladaptive processes?
I'm not sure I understand your question, Joel.
So when we look at these issues that we're having, right? And I think that you can see they're 21st century issues, right?
Sure.
With increases in media and social media and political polarization, these things that continue to be the problems of our day and seem to be getting worse. Do you think that they're positive growth pains? Do you think these technological tools are going to help the human race progress in the future? Or do you think that really the way that they're being used are maladaptive things that we need to find a way to temper?
Yeah. Again, I don't want to predict the future. I have several colleagues that predict the future, and I have a lot of respect for them in certain ways, but I couldn't predict. Things change on a dime like that, and you can't predict that. But if you look back in history, you can see that we have come up with collaborative, societal, or even outlying inventions that society now all has that have greatly increased our our ability to be comfortable in life, is given middle class, lifestyles to many, many more people than were in the last century, and so, but once we latch on to a new idea that seems to be fabulous, we become blind to where it may have negative attributes. And this goes way back in history, wiping out the large land mammals whenever humans came in. For the moment, we're hungry, we're going to eat them, without a thought of, they're all going to be gone someday. Then what are we going to do? We package all kinds of stuff in plastic now without a thought to the downside of the poisons and the obesogens that come from, and perhaps even impediments to reproduction that come from plastic degrading in the oceans and getting into the food chain. So what I'm hoping is that we develop an ability to say, yes, these inventions that we have collaboratively adopted are wonderful things, but we need to collaboratively also say they may have downsides, and we need to address these. We want to address these downsides, and that we become effective at that as pro-social creatures walking the earth. I think that will be necessary, short of some other great invention that steers us that way without us having to put cognitive energy into it. People say, "Oh, technology is going to get us out of this fix." I hope so, but I wouldn't plan on it. I think we need to collectively, I hate to use the word need, we want to collectively join together and say, yeah, some of this isn't working too well, and let's take evasive action here. So I guess that answers your question.
Yeah. Like you said, you go back and Plato thought that writing would be the end of thought, because then you wouldn't have to worry, you wouldn't have to memorize anything. And then of course, we have television and the internet, and now we're into social media where people have always, there's always been people that have decried the increase of technology as the end of the world. But then at the same time, I read a great book called Power Trip by a guy who documents the history of human uses of energy. And a really good line was, yesterday's solution is tomorrow's problem, right? And the land animals was a great demonstration. The one they use in the book is forest, right? We deforested a lot of the planet, heating our homes and cooking our foods. And then we found coal, and then coal was a much more dense energy resource and much cleaner burning. And then coal had its own problems. And we found oil, and oil is much cleaner and much more energy dense. Now oil has its own problems, right? There's not going to be this overarching thing that's going to solve all our problems. There's always going to be a need for continual progression, continual innovation, but most importantly, the ability to review and reflect on the things that, like you said, aren't working, and the identification that those things are causing problems and need to change. And that's an issue we're seeing with climate change, right? There's some people that want to close their eyes to the fact that oil is having a detrimental impact on the environment. But All right, so we're running short on time, which is unfortunate because I feel like we have so much that we could continue to talk about. But before we go, just give the listeners, let them know about your book again, let them know what you want them to check out, and we'll go from there.
Well, thanks, Joel. So the book is Stop Breaking Down, The Secret to Avoiding Overwhelm and Crack-Up. You can access it off my website, kentw.net. It will include discussions about pretty much everything Joel and I have been talking about today, and some other things that I wish we had more time to get into now, but because this has been a very stimulating conversation.
All right. Thanks for being on the show. And until next time, keep pondering.